So welcome back to BioBlast. I am Devin Zeidelman, Director of Scientific Real Estate Advisory Services with Scheer Partner. We have the pleasure of hosting Carsten Brunn, the CEO of Cartesian Therapeutics, based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Gaithersburg, Maryland. Carsten, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Devin. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so before we get into Cartesian specifically, and obviously last year you had the merger with Selecta, which we want to talk a little bit about. But you've had a lot of experiences as we prepare for this meeting, just sort of the arc of your career. You've gone into pharma, you've kind of gone to smaller companies, and now you find yourself leading the charge at Cartesian. And so, what has been your experience over your professional journey?
Yeah, indeed. I had a couple of arcs in my career. I actually started out as a scientist. I did my Ph.D. in endocrine pharmacology. I joined Lilly, so I joined Big Pharma and worked there for almost 10 years. And then actually I went very small biotech in Europe. Then I went private equity in Asia. Then I went to Bayer, obviously big again. And then small biotech, Selecta, and now Cartesian. So I've definitely seen the big and small. I've seen US, ex-US, and kind of this going back between the science and commercial, which I think is a great set of experiences, and been great learnings along the way. But I think the biggest learning probably I've had in the smaller companies, and one of the key challenges for me coming from larger to small is how do you fund a company, right? I mean, the funding environment goes up and down, and was down for quite a while. So I think that's one of the key challenges. How do you capitalize a company? What do you prioritize? What do you focus on? What kind of people do you need? I think that's even more urgent than in larger organizations, and it makes for a great challenge, to be honest. That's the piece I enjoy the most, probably.
Yeah, I think it's the bigger challenge, but then also kind of, as you mentioned earlier, the bigger impact, right, that you would have. You almost can put a little bit more of your thumbprint or fingerprint on what's happening and directing the company. And, just thinking about last year too, when Selecta merged with Cartesian, obviously there's a lot of bolt-on synergies that you identified, but do you think even more importantly, just thinking about how that came about and the history behind it, could you just sort of, it's well publicized, certainly, but just in terms of maybe what's less public in terms of how that came about and sort of those interactions with the founding team?
Yeah, I mean, it came around personal relationship. So I've met Murat maybe a year prior, and we kind of stayed in touch. And then both companies kind of reached an inflection point last year. So for Cartesian, great data in myasthenia gravis, which was published in Lancet Neurology, a lot of interest, but the market was kind of tough to go public. It was a depressed market. And then Selecta, we had a phase 3 readout and a very early pipeline, and felt let's monetize that asset, kind of give that value to investors in the form of a CVR, contingent value right. So that's how we kind of got together. And Murat called me and said, how do you feel about a merger, actually? And we all felt it was a great idea. Obviously, we had a board to approve, but it really boiled down to a personal relationship and connection, and then great business synergies.
Yeah, and you mentioned too, just in terms of the process, it was sign and close, right? You signed the deal the same day you announced the deal.
Yeah, so we try to be as efficient as possible. And it's been a theme for Cartesian and for Selecta. So we did a so-called sign and close, this was announced on November 13th, and it became effective on November 13th as well. So you don't have to run two companies in parallel. It takes a lot of that risk, and you have to basically run two companies and finance two companies. So it's complicated from a legal perspective, and we're happy we got it done, but it's very efficient. And we kept the best of Cartesian. We kept all folks at Cartesian. The two co-founders, Murat and Mike, joined the board, and we kept the majority of the the Selecta legacy board. We have a very strong chair, we have very strong board members. And then from Selecta, we kept the part of the executive team that basically experienced running a public company, myself, our CFO, Blaine, and Matt, our GC. So it was a very smooth transition, bringing those two teams together. And really, the key objective was not to lose track of the patient and executing our clinical programs. And I think we've accomplished that.
Yeah, I mean, Cartesian's are on the forefront of innovative cell and gene therapies, treating a variety of diseases. I would say your leading candidate has been, well documented, phase 3 clinical trials, looking at some results coming out soon. But when you look at the merger, really, and where you are today in terms of the technology and the synergies that you saw, and obviously there's value in a combined balance sheet and leveraging the strengths of one another organization, which you've just hinted on. But from a technological perspective, where did you all see those synergies, and how you continue to introduce opportunities around what is now Cartesian?
Yeah, so we actually kept the technology from Cartesian. So we focused solely on mRNA cell therapy. Selecta was focused on immune tolerance, but we're really put our resources behind the mRNA cell therapy, specifically in autoimmune disease. So we really doubled down on autoimmune disease. Initially, Cartesian also looked at oncology, but I think one of the hot areas, and our technology is really ideally suited to the use in autoimmune disease. We do mRNA CAR T cell therapy, so an autologous, personalized cell therapy. And we have multiple advantages versus the more conventional DNA CAR Ts. So we don't have to do lymphodepletion up front, so no chemotherapy for preconditioning. That means we can do this in an outpatient setting, which is a huge advantage, because you're treating patients with autoimmune disease, and those actually present in an outpatient setting. So that's what we focused on, and that's what we put all our resources behind.
Yeah, and so the team has grown since since the inception, and certainly with some of the additional horsepower that you have now, R&D facilities here in Frederick, Maryland, in the I-270 biotech corridor, and so as you're leading teams, both in Boston and in Maryland, but really, on a global scale, the goal is to commercialize this with international opportunities of which you also have experience. What is your approach to leadership? And then more importantly, how do you work to mitigate any types of risks that are associated with the development of talent?
What I've learned over the years, it's all about the people. It's all about the right people with the right mindset. That's true across big pharma, small biotech. I think it starts at the foundation of respect and integrity. I think that's extremely important. And then, as a leader, being real, being authentic, being transparent, being close to the pulse, which is obviously a lot easier in a small organization. I mean, I know everyone at Cartesian. In a large organization, that's more difficult. And then I think I really see my role around unleashing the potential of everyone. So, everyone has the potential to live up to their full, potential that they have and contribute to the company. That's how I see myself, as a coach, obviously as a contributor as well, but kind of creating the environment for people to grow, unleash ideas, the full potential. And that is easier said than done, of course, but I think that's always been my goal. And I think the other piece, which is not often mentioned when it comes to leadership, is just a sense of humor and fun. I think is really important as well. We spend so much time at work. So, bringing out the humorous side once in a while, I think is very helpful as well.
Yeah. And different talent pools, right? Wherever you're pulling nationally from some of the core markets or emerging markets, arguably you've seen a lot of the differences. And, obviously for Maryland, there's been a lot of comparisons about, we're not Boston, we're not Cambridge, we're not San Diego, but there's obviously a value that you've found being kind of a new entrant, just from your role with Cartesian and now having a presence in Maryland, maybe more so. But how would you sort of compare or benchmark, Boston versus the Maryland markets?
I mean, I have to say I've been extremely impressed by the talent pool, by the folks at Cartesian. There's great scientific talent. You obviously have great academic institutions. You have the NIH. You have your own, local biotech ecosystem, and we've hired basically those. So I think it is quite competitive when you look at the talent. And I think you also have advantages, actually, because, I mean, Boston is a hub, no doubt, and it's probably the biggest hub. But there's more and more big pharma moving in, so things getting a lot more expensive, such as real estate. Getting real estate in Boston is very expensive, and I think Maryland is very, very competitive. So I said I've been extremely impressed by the talent that we have, and we've hired locally for the majority of our positions that we've recruited recently.
Yeah, Maryland's talent market. It's no surprise that, just given the dearth of academia, the educated workforce and population, investment in the K through 12 ecosystem, that really on the forefront of developing strong scientific talent across multiple sectors or subsectors, really. And so with Cartesian being really sort of I would say that on the cutting edge of a lot of the cell and gene therapies, and then certainly being really one of the more innovative companies in the space, how do you maintain your moat? How do you make sure that you're incorporating the best SOPs, the best operating practices to ensure that your pipeline remains robust, to ensure that you remain kind of first in class?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really goes back with your initial question around risk mitigation. Is, I think you always have to think ahead. I think you always have to see, how do you compare to what's the latest cutting edge in terms of innovation, right? So I think by being always at the forefront of that and not becoming complacent, and I think that's really important. But it goes back to the people once again. I think you want people that are leaning in, that are in touch with what's going on in the marketplace. They're in touch with the clinical sites, very practical, talking about our clinical programs. It's really the mindset of obviously, awareness is one thing, and then how do you react to that? And sometimes you don't react. I mean, you double down and feel like, yeah, there's a lot of innovation coming, but we feel we're very strongly positioned. And sometimes you have to pivot, and you incorporate it. And I think that continuous learning, and I think that's what biotech is all about. And that's one of the key differences to big pharma, where it's so slow to change things, and you have all those SOPs, and we probably don't have so many SOPs. Obviously, from a GMP perspective and clinical trial execution. But you don't want to have too much process. You don't be too stifled, actually, and be really external focused, around innovation, regulatory trends, clinical trends, all of that.
Yeah, and so you surrounded yourself with a really strong executive team. Some of it inherited, some of it coming over from Selecta. Obviously, Murat and some of the founders moving more into an advisory role. But with your engagement with both the board and then the scientific advisory group, what do those conversations look like as you're looking towards the future, as you're thinking about advances in, CAR-T, R&D, and cell and gene therapies and mRNA? Are they really concerted, reactive, or are you really taking time to methodically plan and go through different use cases?
Yeah, we're definitely trying to plan, but sometimes in biotech things happen the spur of the moment. But we're trying to be as structured as possible, and obviously Murat and Mike, the two co-founders, are still very involved. We have a science committee. We have one of our board members is a very well-known scientist, Tim Springer, one of the co-founders of Moderna. Obviously, he brings a lot of ideas in and is very connected. So I would say, yeah, we're taking a very measured approach on what indication are we pursuing, what technologies you want to double down on. So for now, we're focused on autologous mRNA CAR-T. We see great results in the clinic, but we also look into the future, which is, maybe more along in situ, so off the shelf, away from the personalized to off the shelf. That's maybe 5 to 10 years out, but these are all areas we're looking to, build the discovery machine around it, and potentially partnerships externally to be prepared for that. And so yeah, we have very strategic discussions around that. Having said this, ultimately you're guided by the data that you release and you generate, right? So I think that's it's always a balance between having a fantastic strategy and then there's the reality of the clinical data you're generating, right? Yeah. So, and I think that's the excitement in biotech. But so far, I think the data we've generated has been extremely exciting in autoimmune disease, and myasthenia gravis, our lead indication.
Yeah, I mean, the lead indication, you're not too far off potentially from commercializing that.
Not quite yet. We have to do a phase 3 first, but we're actually having a readout mid-year of the first placebo-controlled randomized study of any engineered cell therapy in autoimmune disease. So that's a pretty big milestone. Hoping, fingers crossed, that's positive. We obviously want to move into phase 3 as quickly as possible. But I think there's a very clear regulatory path in myasthenia gravis.
Yeah, and so in the marketplace right now, life science at large, you haven't seen a lot of like capital or private investment into smaller pre-revenue companies, and so there's been a lot of consolidation as you look at the patent cliff. You see big pharma trying to diversify, incorporating a lot of the cell and gene therapies and precision medical treatments, for patients, and so. Just given your background, maybe less specifically to Cartesian, but just more of a macro trend, what is your take on the current environment when you look at some of the strategics, when you look at pharma and some of the plays that they're making, in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think, M&A is a key driver for big pharma because, as you rightly mentioned, this patent cliff is hard to fill with in-house R&D, which hasn't been as productive as people are hoping for. So I think they're always looking, externally for innovation, and it doesn't always have to be M&A, but it could be, licensing of technologies. And I think there's definitely a trend. Obviously, there's a couple of themes. One is the whole metabolic area, where I actually did my PhD on GLP-1 regulation. So obviously that has been very successful and being used now also, for weight loss very successfully. Autoimmune disease actually is emerging as a key trend. Many companies embrace that. Many oncology companies pivoting to autoimmunity. So there's definitely a couple of those trends where clearly companies are doubling down, which is great for patients, but obviously makes those spaces a lot more competitive.
Yeah. I mean, it's a competitive space, and we talk a lot with your peers on BioBlast and obviously in day-to-day conversations just about the evolution of the space, looking back on some of the early innovative findings out of UPenn, for example. And so the Mid-Atlantic region has really become sort of this node relative to the rest of the country for a lot of these novel technologies and treating diseases. You all have obviously doubled down on immunology for now and making a concerted push to essentially bring your pipeline forward. And so I guess the question there being that, you've shown some promise in here. Nothing's guaranteed, and pharma, as probably better than me or anyone, is a game of probabilities. 8 to 9 to 10 years for R&D, and then another insert your hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And so, just from like your balance sheet perspective, different service lines, modalities, but then also trying to diversify maybe your service lines. What does that look like for you as you, again, double down on maybe your existing therapies, but then thinking about, all right, where does Cartesian go, leveraging a lot of these, monumental sort of innovations that are on the forefront or on the horizon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for now, we're well capitalized. We actually have cash till the second half of 2026. And we primarily focus on autologous mRNA CAR T for now. And what we're trying to do is really maximize the assets that we do have. Our lead asset is Descartes-8, which we're having in phase 2B in myasthenia gravis, which is a neurological disorder. We're hoping to dose the first patient in SLE, in lupus, first half of this year, so this quarter. So we're trying to build a pipeline, with that asset, really take into multiple indications. But we're also trying to always make better, more advanced next generation assets. So we do have specifically a next generation, which you call Descartes-15, which is more potent than Descartes-8, which we're also hope to take in the clinic this year. So we're definitely trying to maximize what we have and what we know works, but we're also work on next generation. And then we have a very strong R&D group under Chris, our CSO, who comes out of academia in Maryland, who's looking really at the kind of what's the future in cell therapy. And that's really moving from the personalized, which is the now, to hopefully off the shelf in the future and makes us, accessible even for more patients. So we're really trying to span that whole spectrum. But I would say the majority of the funds are used basically on assets in the clinic right now. That's the most expensive piece, but we're also investing into the future.
Yeah. And so part of investing in the future is, it's the ideas piece and technology piece, but it's also, I think, educating peers in the space or startups that are looking to enter. And so in particular, you're well capitalized at Cartesian right now. You talked about 2026 sort of being the end of your current ramp for your cash burn. So what advice would you give to companies that are starting, that have maybe smaller pools of capital, that are looking to extend their cash runway as much as they can, thinking about you're hiring top talent, you need a facility, you need IP protection, all the service professionals that you have to probably either fractionally employ or onboard, where is your head at in thinking about some of that guidance?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question for Murad, and I have to do a shout out to Murad, who was the CEO until November last year, and he's been so capital efficient to the point where when we have investor meetings now, they're like, "How do you get all of this done with so little money?" Actually, right? So, which I think the lesson is that you can do things, you don't have to use, for example, right now we're not using a CRO for clinical trials. We will in the phase 3, but we've managed this in a very efficient way. We've built our own GMP facility, right? So I think just being mindful and not go with the most expensive, solution is definitely a way to kind of stretch your money. I think that's one area, and the other one is just have the courage early on to kill projects that you know aren't going to make it, right? And there's always an inherent tendency we got to hold on. So I think making decisions early on and really focus early on, I think that's really important as well.
Yeah. And so in the decision-making process for you, just your experience, ultimately as CEO, and there's a board to report to, right? Ultimately, but you kind of have your finger on the button. And so, you mentioned earlier how you really are intentional about being inclusive, being sort of more loose in the culture in terms of just being sort of, comedic in a sense, and having sort of an opportunity to be yourself, which I think is really important in today's workforce. But the decision-making process is something that, from your lens, have you had more success in one approach versus another approach to kind of come into that final yes or no?
I think actually the decision making is a very structured approach, actually.
Okay.
And it's really, first of all, I think it's really important to get all the input. It's, well, I'm ultimately responsible is that I'm not sitting here, making decisions. I mean, it's really getting input from everyone, discuss as a team, get outside perspective. Where's the market headed? What are the right clinical endpoints to use? And I think once you have all the information, you kind of, have a decision funnel tree. And of course, there's some belief you have to bring in, and you have to make bets. And Cartesian definitely has made bets, which maybe were not en vogue at the time. I mean, doing mRNA 7, 8 years ago, I mean, was definitely gutsy, right? And now, thanks to the mRNA vaccines, it's mainstream now. But I think so. You've got to focus on the things that you believe in and drive those.
Yeah. And so then with that being said, what is your approach to, culture building? You touched it a little bit broadly earlier, but is it something that you all think about intentionally? And then, maybe what are some of the differentiators that you feel like Cartesian has that, you've learned over the years being in, different roles?
It's a great culture, and you can always tell when you have low turnover. We had very, very low turnover. But it's like any relationship. It's like a marriage. It's you have to work on it, and you have to be intentional about it, especially when you grow. And we're growing now, so it's really important to have culture as one of the criteria when you recruit someone. It's the culture fit is so important. You might have the smartest person in a certain area. If the culture fit is not there, it can get toxic very quickly. So I think being mindful around it, and having open discussions. And obviously, we're still in a forming process. We've just went through this reverse merge in November, but we're definitely intentional about it. We've just hired a chief people officer who brings a lot of experience, Jess, and who's also from the region. And having initiatives where you involve people. It's little things like we're moving to Frederick, where we establishing a phase 3 commercial GMP facility. Involving people in the design of the facility, the layout, all those things. I think those are the things that actually build culture. But the most important thing is to be intentional about it and have it, on the forefront of all decisions you make, basically.
Yeah, and so when you underwent this transition from founders, to you taking the helm as CEO, what were you super intentional about at the onset, and what were some of the things that you made sure you did when you started in your role?
I think it's so important to respect the culture that's there, and experience that culture, and not come in and say, hey, we're going to do everything different. I definitely have a different leadership style than Murad, and we definitely had our discussions around this. But I think respecting what's there, working with that, and then as a team together, shape it, mold it. I think that's the approach we have taken, and it was probably the biggest risk that we had, that we lose the culture with this merge. And I think we haven't done that, and we've definitely, I think, started to evolve it, and it has to evolve. You move from a private to public company, but being intentional about it. And I think as a starting point would help that the cultures at Cartesian and Selecta were not that different, very science-driven, very people-driven. So that made it definitely easier.
Yeah. And so the transition from private to public, sometimes is difficult, from a variety of both operational concerns, the way you're approaching OKRs, the way you're structuring the team or the different business units. And so what do you think are the primary differences once a company does, in fact, go public, whether it's through reverse merger, such as Cartesian Selecta, or you see a lot of pipe financing or some convertible debt out there. But, what are some of the biggest, moments that you have to really be conscious of within that transition?
Yeah, I think it's just all the rules and regulations you have with the SEC around being a public company. So we actually spend quite a bit of time educating everyone around what does it actually mean to be a public company, the quarterly earnings reports, the case, the Qs, and all the terminology that's new to folks, and the do's and don'ts. You can't disclose non-public information, things like that. So it's an educational piece, and what I was surprised actually how much interest there is actually. We still have weekly Scrum meetings, and oftentimes we get asked. We did a reverse stock split recently, so people are curious, like explain what does that mean. So I think there's a lot of interest actually. But it's definitely a big step on around the compliance of things, the financial reporting, giving guidance externally that you have to stick to. So all of those things. But it's a continuous journey, but actually it has been fairly smooth. I mean, maybe some people felt it was a little bit stifling in the beginning. But I think everybody understands. We're trying to keep it as practical as possible and pragmatic as possible.
Yeah, yeah, well said, well said. I know it's certainly not an easy task, but there's passion, respect built in, and I think that gets you very far as well. And so, you've been nominated, talking about kind of passion and respect, and really Cartesian as a finalist for the BioBuzz Awards. And in terms of the community, being nominated by the community. What does it mean for you guys and gals?
Yeah, it's a huge honor to be recognized, and it's really a huge honor and recognition for the team that built this from scratch, day one. Set up in Maryland, grew in Maryland, dedicated to Maryland. We know this is a competitive space, so I think it's really a recognition to the co-founders, Murad and Mike, and the team that built this and brought this all the way into the clinic and to patients. And so it means a lot. And, employees will be thrilled to hear of the news.
Yeah. No, it's well put. Special shout out to Murad and Mike. I mean, they built an incredible company and something that you obviously are continuing to grow their legacy, but also establish your legacy. And so we're just excited to be partners with you at Scheer Partners and continue to see you grow in the Maryland market and beyond. So, really appreciate you spending time with us today on BioBlast, and, hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for the opportunity, and thanks for the award.
Absolutely. Thanks.